The story opens in a way that feels less like a historical account and more like a moment frozen in time, as if the past itself had been disturbed and was slowly reacting to it. In 1922, Howard Carter stood at the edge of one of archaeology's most important discoveries, but at that moment, there was no sense of celebration, only tension and uncertainty. When he made that small opening in the sealed wall, it wasn't just a physical breakthrough. It was the first breach in a space that had been untouched for over 3,000 years. As he held the candle up, the air rushing out wasn't just warm or stale. It was described as something almost unnatural, as if the tomb had been waiting in silence and finally exhaled. Then came the glint of gold, faint at first, then undeniable, revealing that something immense had been preserved beyond imagination. Behind him stood Lord Carnarvon, whose financial support had kept the expedition alive through years of disappointment and doubt. His simple question, asking if anything could be seen, carried no sense of what was about to unfold. Carter's answer, short and overwhelmed, marked the beginning of something that would outlive both of them, because from that moment forward, this discovery stopped being just archaeology and became something far more unsettling in the public imagination. A narrative began forming almost immediately, one that connected the tomb not only to ancient history, but to modern misfortune, and it set the tone for everything that would follow. To understand how this discovery escalated into legend, it's important to follow the slow build-up that led to that breakthrough moment. Howard Carter had been working in the Valley of the Kings for years with very little success, facing constant pressure from funding limitations and growing skepticism from the academic world. Many believed he was chasing something that simply wasn't there anymore, that the tombs had already been found or destroyed long before his time. Lord Carnarvon himself had nearly decided to withdraw support, convinced that the project might never yield results, but Carter's persistence kept the search alive, and eventually subtle clues began to appear in the sand, small indicators that something remained hidden beneath the surface. The discovery of a buried step changed everything, leading to a sealed doorway marked with ancient inscriptions. When they finally identified the name Tutankhamun, the scale of what they had found slowly began to sink in. This was not just another tomb, it was a royal burial, untouched by time. As they cleared deeper passages, the sense of anticipation grew stronger, and when the second sealed chamber was opened, the reality exceeded every expectation. The room was filled with objects of extraordinary craftsmanship and value, arranged in a way that suggested deliberate preservation rather than abandonment. Yet even in the excitement of discovery, there were reports of unease among workers and observers, as though the atmosphere inside the chamber carried something difficult to explain. That feeling would later become part of the legend, especially after events outside the tomb began to unfold in ways no one could have predicted. What transformed this archaeological breakthrough into a global mystery was not just what was found inside the tomb, but what seemed to happen afterward. The death of Lord Carnarvon became the central focus of the emerging narrative, especially because of the timing and the suddenness with which his health declined. Official explanations pointed to infection and complications from a minor injury, yet the speed of his deterioration captured public attention in a way no scientific report could fully control. Newspapers quickly began connecting unrelated events, adding layers of dramatic interpretation that turned a medical case into something far more symbolic. Reports of power failures and strange coincidences at the time of his death spread widely, even though many of these claims were later questioned or unverified. Still, the story had already taken on a life of its own. As years passed, other individuals associated with the excavation were reported to have experienced illness or unexpected deaths, reinforcing the idea that something was attached to the tomb itself. However, this narrative became more complicated when examining the broader data. Howard Carter, who had the closest physical contact with the burial chamber, lived for many years afterward without any similar fate. This contradiction introduced doubt into the idea of a singular cause behind the events. Later, scientific discussions proposed environmental explanations, suggesting that long-sealed spaces could contain biological agents, like fungal spores, capable of causing illness when disturbed. These theories provided a rational framework, but they also failed to fully explain why outcomes varied so dramatically between individuals exposed to the same environment. This tension between explanation and uncertainty kept the story alive far beyond its historical origins. As the decades passed, similar patterns began to surface in other parts of the world, adding weight to the idea that something consistent might be occurring whenever ancient sealed sites were disturbed. In Poland, within the historic Wawel Cathedral, researchers opened the tomb of King Kazimierz Jagiellon after centuries of silence. The project was carried out with scientific intent, focused on documentation and preservation rather than speculation. Initially, everything proceeded as expected, with careful analysis of remains and artifacts, followed by respectful reburial procedures. But within months of the excavation, members of the research team began experiencing serious health issues and sudden deaths. The sequence of events quickly drew public attention, and media outlets began labeling it as another example of a historical curse. Some scientists later suggested environmental causes, including exposure to biological contaminants preserved within sealed organic matter for centuries. However, unlike controlled laboratory conditions, the historical setting made it difficult to confirm exact causes with certainty. Not all participants were affected, and the inconsistency of outcomes made it harder to establish a clear pattern. This unpredictability became the central problem for scientific interpretation. If a biological factor was responsible, it did not behave uniformly across exposure cases. Yet, if coincidence was the only explanation, the repetition of similar outcomes across different historical sites and time periods became difficult to dismiss entirely. This unresolved tension between statistical normality and perceived pattern continued to fuel debate, keeping the story active in both academic and popular discussions. A similar narrative resurfaced dramatically with the discovery of the Ötzi Ice Man in the Alps, a naturally preserved human body dating back more than 5,000 years. When the remains were first discovered, there was no immediate understanding of their age or significance, and initial assumptions treated the body as that of a recently deceased climber. Only later did scientific analysis reveal the extraordinary historical importance of the find. As the body was recovered and transported for study, individuals involved in the process became part of a growing list of unexpected deaths that soon attracted public attention. A forensic expert, a journalist documenting the discovery, and later researchers connected to the analysis all passed away under sudden or unusual circumstances. These events, while statistically limited, became emotionally amplified due to their connection to a single discovery. One particularly striking detail was the perception of repeating patterns or symbolic echoes between the discovery scene and later incidents, which added to the sense of mystery surrounding the case. However, broader scientific review emphasized that thousands of individuals were involved in the research over time without incident, and that the number of deaths did not exceed expected statistical variation for large groups. Still, the human mind tends to connect isolated events into meaningful narratives, especially when they share emotional or visual similarities. In the case of Ötzi, this psychological tendency played a major role in transforming a scientific discovery into a widely discussed mystery, even in the absence of definitive evidence supporting any supernatural interpretation. The discovery of the Ukok princess in Siberia added another layer to this expanding pattern, combining archaeology with deep cultural and environmental context. The mummy, preserved in permafrost conditions, was remarkably intact, revealing intricate tattoos and burial artifacts that provided insight into ancient societies of the region. However, from the very beginning, the excavation was surrounded by tension between scientific interpretation and local spiritual belief. Indigenous groups in the area viewed the burial site as sacred, believing it served as a boundary between worlds that should not be disturbed. Shortly after the removal and transport of the remains, various incidents occurred involving mechanical failures, transport difficulties, and environmental disturbances. Over time, these events were grouped together into a narrative suggesting a connection between the excavation and subsequent regional instability, including natural disasters. Scientific explanations pointed to geological factors, noting that the region is naturally prone to seismic activity and has experienced earthquakes long before any archaeological work took place. Despite this, public perception often favored a more symbolic interpretation, linking human interference with ancient resting places to broader consequences. The persistence of this belief highlights how cultural context can influence the interpretation of natural events, especially when they align temporally with emotionally significant discoveries. This dual interpretation, scientific versus symbolic, continued to define how the story of the Ukok princess was understood, reinforcing the broader theme seen across multiple cases.